The world changed on the night of April 13th, 2024. For decades, Israel and Iran had traded blows through proxies, digital warfare, and shadow assassinations. But that night, Iran launched hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles directly from its soil toward Israel, a clear signal that the rules of engagement had shifted irreversibly. While nearly 99% of the projectiles were intercepted by Israel's advanced defense systems, the symbolism mattered more than the statistics. Iran was no longer hiding behind Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, or Houthi rebels. It had declared its readiness to engage Israel face-to-face. From that moment on, an arc of escalation curved sharply toward outright war. The months that followed, the tit-for-tat escalated, but it was always calculated. Israel conducted precision strikes on Iranian military advisors in Syria and Lebanon, targeting weapons, convoys, and command centers. Iran responded through cyber attacks and by greenlighting its proxies to hit Israeli and U.S. interests in the region. But even then, both sides seemed to understand the limits. Until June 13, 2025. That night, a series of loud explosions tore through the Iranian skyline. Israeli Air Force had launched one of its most aggressive direct strikes in history, what would later be called Operation Rising Lion. With nearly 100 fighter jets, including F-35Is and F-15Is, flying deep into Iranian territory and launching waves of GBU-28 bunker buster bombs and Spice 1000 munitions, Israel struck more than 100 high-value targets. The list included missile depots in Kermanshah, nuclear facilities in Natanz, radar installations near Tehran, and even the Bushehr nuclear power plant. The strikes weren't random. In the weeks leading up to the operation, Mossad had activated deep cover agents and autonomous drones inside Iran to sabotage air defense systems. One Mossad unit reportedly smuggled drones disguised as construction equipment into a Tehran warehouse, which then activated simultaneously to blind Iranian radar arrays moments before the airstrike. Iranian command and control structures were scrambled, and for several hours, Israel held near-total air superiority over key zones. Tehran's response was swift. Within hours, more than 200 ballistic missiles and over 150 armed drones were launched toward Israeli cities. Air raid sirens blared across Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem. The Iron Dome and David Sling systems lit up the sky, intercepting the majority of the threats, but not all. A missile struck a residential building in southern Israel, killing 6. Others damaged power grids and communications networks. The back-and-forth barrage continued for days. By June 17th, Iran had lost over 224 people in the Israeli airstrikes. With thousands injured and entire sectors of its nuclear infrastructure inoperable. Centrifuges at Natanz were destroyed. Some estimates say up to 15,000 units. The energy grid suffered repeated outages, particularly around Isfahan and Tehran. Iran's ballistic missile bases were cratered, many of them rendered useless. Yet Iran's leadership, including Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei and IRGC commanders, vowed revenge and framed the strikes as proof of Zionist aggression. Iranian state media showed images of destroyed hospitals and schools, some of which Western intelligence claims were near military installations. The narrative war was just as intense as the physical one. In Israel, 24 people had died, most from missile impacts in areas where defense systems failed or were overwhelmed. Over 600 civilians were treated for injuries ranging from shrapnel wounds to burns. Damage was widespread in Tel Aviv's industrial sector and the port of Ashdod. The Israeli military claimed they had intercepted over 90% of incoming threats, but the cost was staggering. The Iron Dome system, while effective, cost roughly $50,000 per interceptor. David Sling and Arrow 3 systems could reach into the millions per unit. By mid-June, Israeli military sources warned that they were on pace to run out of interceptors within 10 to 12 days unless resupplied by the United States. Despite the devastation, both sides maintained that they were in control. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that the operation was surgical and necessary. To dismantle Iran's nuclear and missile threat, he called on the Iranian people to rise up against their regime, implying that this war was not against the Iranian people, but against their rulers. Iran's leadership framed the Israeli strikes as an extension of Western imperialism and emphasized its own right to self-defense. Iran made it clear through intermediaries in Oman and Qatar that it was willing to consider negotiations on one condition: Israel must halt its strikes. The message was mixed. While Tehran seemed open to diplomacy, it simultaneously escalated its rhetoric, vowing to inflict unimaginable pain if provoked further. The international response was urgent, but divided. The G7 nations, meeting in Canada at the time, issued a general call for de-escalation, but the language was notably soft. The United States, under the leadership of Donald Trump, took a harder line. Domestically, Trump's strategy stirred controversy. Democratic leaders called for urgent diplomatic talks and criticized Trump's hardline approach as inflammatory. The American public appeared divided. Polls showed that while a majority supported Israel's right to defend itself, there was little appetite for direct U.S. military involvement. The trauma of Iraq and Afghanistan lingered, and many Americans feared a new entanglement that could cost billions in more lives. Other global powers reacted cautiously. Russia condemned Israel's strikes and warned against what it called Western double standards. President Vladimir Putin, while managing his own war in Ukraine, saw an opportunity to criticize American foreign policy. China issued a call for peace and non-intervention, but also condemned any attack on sovereign nations, clearly aligning with Iran's narrative. Turkey's President Erdogan, a longtime critic of Israeli policy, described the airstrikes as barbaric and offered to mediate talks between Tehran and Tel Aviv. Saudi Arabia, usually opposed to Iran, surprised some observers by quietly urging restraint on both sides, fearful that war could spill across its own borders or destabilize oil markets. As missiles flew and death tolls rose, many in the international community feared that this conflict, if left unchecked, could spiral into a full-scale regional war. The Strait of Hormuz remained open, but Iranian officials hinted at potential closures if attacked again. Global oil prices jumped briefly, but stabilized, partly due to diplomatic efforts and market speculation that both sides would reach their military limits soon. Still, tension hung thick in the air. On June 16th, an Israeli fighter jet was reportedly shot down over central Iran, killing 2 pilots. That same night, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that it had successfully tested a new hypersonic missile, a chilling sign that the arms race was far from over. By June 17th, both Israel and Iran had sustained heavy losses, but neither showed signs of backing down. Iran continued to fire reduced volleys of drones and missiles down from hundreds to dozens, but the intent remained unchanged. Israel carried out new waves of airstrikes, this time targeting underground storage bunkers and suspected nuclear enrichment tunnels near Fordow. That site, buried nearly 300 feet underground, had long been considered impenetrable without U.S.-grade bunker-busting bombs. Israeli officials hinted they might request such munitions from Washington, further entwining the U.S. in the unfolding war. What was once an invisible war waged in whispers and shadows had now erupted into the most visible and volatile conflict in the Middle East in decades. And as of now, there's no clear end in sight.
The air was thick with tension across the Middle East as June 18th dawned with sirens wailing in cities that had once thought themselves outside the reach of war. What had begun as strategic retaliation had now morphed into a sustained, region-shaking confrontation. The skies over both Israel and Iran were never fully dark or fully light, illuminated constantly by the bursts of interceptor missiles, drone explosions, and the haunting glow of fire across damaged neighborhoods. This wasn't just a military exchange, it was an ideological collision fueled by decades of mistrust, religious division, and geopolitical chess moves. The Iranian Supreme Council held emergency sessions daily, often from underground bunkers near The IRGC, though battered, continued to function with surprising coordination. Their command posts in Tehran had been moved deeper underground, and Iranian television began broadcasting patriotic anthems between hourly reports of resistance and victory. Iran's leadership portrayed the war as existential, claiming Israel sought the destruction of the Islamic Republic itself, not just its nuclear capabilities. This messaging was consistent across Persian-language broadcasts, reaching millions inside and outside the country. Meanwhile, Hezbollah increased its involvement from southern Lebanon. On June 19th, over 140 rockets were fired into northern Israel, killing 3 people in Nahariya and injuring dozens. Israel responded with airstrikes in Baalbek and the Bekaa Valley, targeting what it claimed were Iranian missile stockpiles disguised as humanitarian centers. On the ground, Israeli reservists were being called up at unprecedented rates. By June 20th, nearly 160,000 reserve soldiers had been mobilized. The IDF initiated drills near the Golan Heights, anticipating possible Syrian involvement or Iranian reinforcements entering from Iraq. Cyber warfare also escalated. Israeli infrastructure systems in Haifa suffered a brief but serious outage, believed to be the result of a coordinated Iranian targeting desalination plants and power grids. In retaliation, Israel's Unit 8200 disabled several Iranian financial databases and allegedly infiltrated servers tied to Iran's nuclear research apparatus. These digital blows, although bloodless, proved as disruptive as physical strikes. Amid the chaos, international actors scrambled to contain the fire. France and Germany urged both sides to accept ceasefire terms, offering to host indirect talks in Geneva. The United Nations Security Council convened multiple emergency sessions, but vetoes from the US and Russia paralyzed any meaningful resolution. Trump authorized the deployment of an additional carrier strike group to the Persian Gulf and greenlit a $4 billion emergency arms transfer to Israel, including advanced interceptor systems, smart bombs, and intelligence support. But Trump stopped short of ordering direct attacks on Iran, instead focusing on maximum pressure through sanctions and diplomacy. Back home in the U.S., the war became a political flashpoint. Democratic leaders, including Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a return to diplomacy. Meanwhile, protest movements formed in major cities. Some rallies supported Israel's right to self-defense, while others criticized both nations for risking global security. Public sentiment in the U.S. remained mixed. A June 21st Gallup poll showed 52% of Americans supported Israel's actions as defensive, while 35% believed Israel had gone too far. Only 27% of respondents supported U.S. military involvement, but nearly 70% supported continued arms and intelligence aid to Israel. As for Iran, it leaned heavily on its allies. Russia supplied limited radar and satellite imagery under the guise of commercial aid, while China provided economic relief, facilitating oil sales through alternative banking routes to avoid U.S. sanctions. North Korea even offered symbolic support, issuing a statement condemning Israel and the United States for military imperialism. More critically, Iran encouraged Shiite militias across Iraq and Syria to increase their attacks on U.S. bases in the region. Between June 19th and June 22nd, U.S. military outposts in Iraq were targeted by drone and rocket attacks, wounding 17 soldiers and forcing the Pentagon to heighten alert levels. Although no deaths were reported, the pressure on American personnel overseas surged. Inside Iran, the effects of Israel's strategic bombing campaign began to emerge more clearly. Fuel shortages spread through major cities. Iranian media attempted to suppress images of long gas lines and supermarket shortages, but footage leaked through VPNs and encrypted platforms. Protests began to bubble up not against Israel, but against the Iranian leadership. In cities like Shiraz and Tabriz, crowds gathered demanding transparency, food, and power. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard swiftly clamped down, arresting dozens and issuing stern warnings against sedition. Still, a sense of internal strain became evident. Israel faced its own forms of exhaustion. After more than a week of near-continuous alert, civilian life across the country was Airports operated at limited capacity. Schools were shut down. Businesses shuttered or functioned only underground. Though Israel's military maintained operational superiority, the psychological toll was mounting. Parents slept in stairwells, children lived in bomb shelters, and sirens could sound at any hour. Despite this, Israeli society showed a remarkable sense of unity. Civil defense teams and local municipalities worked around the clock, and donations poured in to support affected families. Netanyahu remained defiant. In an address broadcast globally on June 22, he stated, "We will not stop until Iran's ability to harm Israel is permanently neutralized." By June 23, whispers of a broader coalition forming began to take shape. Jordan and Egypt, two of Israel's neighbors, with whom it had peace treaties, expressed growing concern about escalation. Egypt's intelligence services opened secret channels to both sides, attempting to broker a limited ceasefire. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia, while not directly involved, reportedly shared satellite data with Israeli defense agencies, driven by their mutual interest in curbing Iranian power. The Saudis walked a fine line, offering quiet support to Israel while making public statements about regional peace. The war's most alarming development came on the night of June 24, when Iranian state TV aired footage of a long-range missile being loaded onto a mobile launcher near Mecca. Analysts quickly speculated that the missile, possibly a Shahab 5 variant, could reach southern Europe or beyond. Whether this was mere posturing or a real threat, the message was clear. Iran was willing to escalate beyond regional boundaries if pushed further. In response, NATO held a crisis meeting, though no member nation was directly under attack. Article 4 discussions were initiated due to the increasing proximity of the conflict to European borders. Poland and Romania began moving air defense assets eastward, fearing an unintended back in Israel. preparations were underway for what was believed to be a final, decisive blow. Sources indicated that the IDF was preparing Operation Final Echo, a campaign designed to cripple Iran's remaining underground bunkers and nuclear research sites once and for all. This plan involved electronic warfare units, advanced bunker-busting bombs, and long-range missile systems previously held in reserve. Yet, questions swirled internally. How much longer could Israel sustain such an offensive without pushing Iran into truly desperate measures? The Mossad warned that cornering Tehran might prompt the use of chemical agents or attacks on foreign embassies. And so, as the second week of war closed, the world stood on the precipice of either diplomatic resolution or unrestrained escalation. The death toll had surpassed 2,000, with tens of thousands wounded across both nations. Yet despite the magnitude of destruction, neither Iran nor Israel showed signs of halting their missions. Israel sought total elimination of Iran's nuclear and long-range missile capabilities. Iran, meanwhile, aimed to deliver enough pain to deter further Israeli aggression and rally domestic and regional support. From the corridors of the Pentagon to the alleys of Tehran, everyone now understood this was no longer a battle of precision, but a war of endurance. And as the world watched, it asked, who would blink first? By June 25, 2025, what began as a retaliatory series of airstrikes had spiraled into a war whose ripple effects were beginning to unbalance the global order. The Israel-Iran conflict, once confined to proxy battles in the shadows, was now the most visible and volatile confrontation on the planet. As both nations approached their third week of hostilities, the question on every strategist's mind was whether this war was still under control, or if the threshold into a broader Middle Eastern collapse had already been crossed. Behind the lines, in bunkers and war rooms across Washington, Tehran, and Tel Aviv, decisions were being made that could determine not only the future of these two adversaries, but the trajectory of regional and perhaps global conflict for years to come. The Israeli operation, codenamed Final Echo, launched at 3:12 a.m. local time on June 26, using refueled long-range fighter jets supported by Gulf-based intelligence satellites. Israel struck deep inside Iran's most fortified facility. It was a bold move. The underground enrichment plant was buried beneath nearly 80 meters of concrete and mountain rock. Previous estimates assumed that only U.S.-manufactured GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators could reach its core. Yet, using a series of advanced electromagnetic pulse attacks, followed by phased deep penetration munitions and air-to-ground drone swarms, Israel claimed to have disabled the main centrifuge chambers and collapsed significant portions of the facility's underground levels. Iran admitted to the strike but denied that Fordo's core had been compromised. In reality, satellite imagery suggested massive structural damage. Intelligence agencies from multiple nations concluded that Iran's ability to enrich uranium had been set back by at least 5 to 7 years. Iran's response was characteristically rather than escalate with another wave of overt missile attacks, Tehran unleashed a wave of coordinated. On June 27, Israel's largest hospital network, a major telecom provider, and the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange were paralyzed for 14 hours. Emergency services were delayed, banking systems scrambled, and for the first time, Israeli citizens saw not just missiles in the sky, but systems failing at their fingertips. The IRGC-backed hackers claimed responsibility under the moniker Eternal Martyr Brigade. Simultaneously, Hezbollah launched a surprise assault from Lebanon, involving dozens of anti-tank guided missiles and drone swarms, targeting IDF outposts along the northern border. 10 Israeli soldiers were killed. Netanyahu ordered an immediate response's sustained bombardment of Hezbollah strongholds from both air and sea, stretching from Tyre to Balkan. In Tehran, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei framed the moment as historic. His speech's shifted tone from outrage to martyrdom. He declared the war a purification process, accusing Israel and the United States of trying to rewrite the balance of power in the Muslim world. Meanwhile, Iranian civilians bore the brunt of the suffering. The economy, already strained from years of sanctions, was now in freefall. Inflation hit 185%, fuel lines stretched for blocks, and basic goods like rice and flour became scarce in some provinces. Protests grew in number but were met with increasing repression. The Basij militias and IRGC patrolled the streets of Tehran and Mashhad in armored vehicles. More than 4,000 people had been arrested by June 28, and local reports described beatings and disappearances in the night. Across the ocean, Washington stood in a tense balance. Trump's team faced pressure from both hawks and doves. Neoconservative voices on Capitol Hill urged a more direct approach, suggesting limited strikes on IRGC targets in Iraq or Syria. Others, particularly among Democrats and military veterans, warned of a slippery slope toward full-scale, regional war. Trump remained characteristically defiant. At the same time, he ordered B-52 bombers to be placed on high alert in Diego Garcia, and instructed the Department of Energy to begin contingency planning in case Iran attempted to mine the Strait of Hormuz. The economic consequences of the war were no longer regional. Global oil prices surged past $135 a barrel. Shipping companies rerouted their cargo lines, and insurance rates on tankers skyrocketed. Several European nations, now facing energy insecurity, pushed aggressively for an immediate ceasefire. Germany's chancellor, France's president, and the EU High Representative jointly issued a 72-hour proposal for a cooling-off period. The plan suggested a mutual halt to airstrikes, a rollback of proxy activity, and the establishment of a UN-monitored demilitarized buffer. Israel responded with caution. Netanyahu agreed to pause strikes if Iran stopped its drone and rocket attacks. Iran, however, refused, insisting that any ceasefire must include the complete lifting of sanctions condition the West was not prepared to accept. Meanwhile, the information war continued. Both Israel and Iran flooded social media with carefully curated images. Israel highlighted intercepted missiles, civilian casualties from Hezbollah rockets, and surgical strikes on military facilities. Iran's state media showcased damaged apartment buildings, wounded children, and crowds chanting In the U.S., this digital propaganda campaign spilled into partisan debate. Conservative influencers on platforms like X and Truth Social praised Israel's precision and bravery. Liberal voices focused on civilian harm and the risks of blind support for a war with no end in sight. The divide became more than political, was generational. Younger Americans leaned toward By June 30th, the death toll on both sides had become difficult to track. Israel reported 78 military and 32 civilian deaths. Iran's numbers were harder to confirm, with estimates ranging from 2,300 to 3,500 dead, mostly IRGC members and support personnel. The real horror, however, was among civilians caught between strikes, fuel shortages, and failed hospitals. International humanitarian agencies struggled to gain access, particularly inside Iran. The Red Crescent and SANS pleaded for open corridors, warning that health infrastructure was nearing collapse. Several aid convoys were destroyed in airstrikes, sparking accusations that both sides were ignoring international law. Netanyahu blamed Hezbollah for storing weapons in civilian trucks. Iran accused Israel of deliberately targeting relief zones. As July approached, so did war fatigue. In both Iran and Israel, citizens began questioning whether victoire d'évertement was even possible. Some Israeli reservists, now deployed for over 14 days, spoke anonymously to international media about exhaustion and mental strain. In Iran, desertions from the regular army increased. Unverified footage surfaced of soldiers abandoning posts in the border, but even with growing cracks, neither leadership showed signs of backing down. Israel's cabinet debated a limited ground incursion into southern Lebanon to dismantle Hezbollah's rocket capabilities permanently. Iran threatened to retaliate by flooding Iraq with IRGC reinforcements and activating militias in Syria and Yemen to widen the battlefield. The most pivotal moment came on July 2nd, when a commercial airliner flying from Dubai to Istanbul was narrowly missed by a misfired Iranian anti-air battery, which had malfunctioned during a botched test near Tabriz. Though no one was hurt, global airlines suspended routes across Iranian airspace, plunging the region into further isolation. The United Arab Emirates and Qatar, which had played roles as silent intermediaries, intensified back. A secret meeting was arranged in Muscat, bringing in European diplomats, U.S. military liaisons, and Iranian intelligence officers under Omani protection. The terms discussed were simple: a phased ceasefire, return to pre-conflict borders, prisoner exchanges, and gradual sanction relief in exchange for verified By July 4th, perhaps ironically, America's Independence Day, word leaked that a temporary ceasefire was being drafted. For the first time since April 13th, no missiles flew that night. Sirens were silent. Families in Tel Aviv came out of shelters. In Tehran, the internet flickered back to life. Talks continued behind the scenes, while the public face of both governments maintained a tone of defiance. Yet it was evident that the war had reached its saturation point. Strategic targets were exhausted. Civilian morale was frayed. The international community, from Beijing to Brussels, demanded a return to stability. This war, born from decades of tension and a single cascade of drone strikes, may not have produced a winner, but it had certainly created thousands of losers' families, broken, cities scarred, futures reaped. Both Israel and Iran, in pursuing what they claimed were defensive missions, had reshaped the Middle East into something neither had fully anticipated. While missiles may stop flying, the narratives, mistrust, and trauma will linger far longer, and the world, once again, will be left trying to rebuild a peace that was never allowed to fully grow.